Learning Latin makes you think about what you're saying in a different way than you would when you're speaking English. That when you are speaking English, you express, you express what you want to say the way English would have you do it. And two, you just express it unthinkingly because we use English unthinkingly.
Welcome to Classical Etc. You're in the studio with Memoria Press.
The last time I had experienced anesthesia, I was very young. And so I thought I'm going to be like a documentarian here. I'm going to pay close attention to the physical experience of going under. And all I remember was me saying, fascinating. And then the next thing I know, I'm being helped out the door.
Hello, and welcome to another episode of Classical Etc. I'm Jessica Aboud, and I am here with Tanya, Paul, and our guest, Mr. John Christensen. John, welcome to the show.
Howdy, howdy.
Yeah, John is here at our Louisville HLS campus. You serve as a Latin teacher in various capacities, and you are the Latin director at Memoria Press. So we've got an expert in our midst when it comes to Latin.
So I wonder Latin, what we're going to talk about today.
I know.
And Greek.
Welcome, John.
You guys got me real good. All right, Latin.
Latin is the topic of our show today. But before we get to that, we have a couple things. John, we usually go around and share what we're reading. I'll let you go last. You can think about it.
Okay.
But Paul and Tanya know the drill. So, Paul, how about you?
I mentioned several episodes ago I was listening to Outlive about health. So I've picked that back up because I finished my book on Die with Zero. But really, what I really want to talk about was Horatius.
It's today.
Today was Horatius Day at school, and I got pulled in at one campus. Yeah. I got pulled in literally 2 minutes before the kids were going to start reciting to be one of the listeners. And I sat there and I listened, and I thought, I shouldn't say this on air because I don't want to actually do it, but I do want to do it, that I should go back and memorize it.
Isn't it great? It's a great story.
And when you're sitting there listening to it, I could just picture Winston Churchill like reciting this at a table while they're all sitting there with their British food and smoking cigars, and I could so see how it lends itself to that. Like, and I wanted to tell each one of these kids when they're done, like, don't walk out of here and forget this. Like, you need to review this regularly over the next several months and years so that you have this. Because I think it would just be in some ways it's a party trick. In some ways, like what it is extolling, our culture needs to hear again and again and again. So I heard it 4 times this morning. And so
and I did too.
And it's its own little book.
But there's so many, it takes 20 minutes to do one
recitation,
around 20 minutes. And we had so many kids do it. It took 6 or 7 adults to listen, and we each had 4 or 5. So it's a big commitment.
60, how many stanzas?
70.
70 stanzas. Okay.
And it's not easy.
No.
The words are
they're hard.
They're difficult.
I looked over it this morning and they're going to do this.
But they did it with what seemed ease, even though I know they've been working on it since probably last summer. And so now they can go home tonight and not recite Horatius.
Yeah. Oh, so that's what you've been reading?
That's what I was reading this morning.
Yeah.
Multiple times.
Yeah.
But it was enjoyable. I mean, that's the kind of thing. I mean, you should just pick it up every once in a while and just reread that story. It's just a great story.
Yeah. Tanya?
I'm still reading The Tenant of Wildfeld Hall, and I've got only about 120 pages left. It is very good, but it is different than, it reminds me more of George Eliot than the other Bronte sister books, which are rather have that gothic dark feel, Jane Eyre and Wuthering Heights. And this is just more of a George Eliot kind of
not dark, just kind of standard.
It's about people, it doesn't have that dark, gloomy
setting,
atmospheric setting. That it is a little bit melodramatic because I guess it's just the time period that it's. But I think George Eliot's a little melodramatic too. So, but I really like it, and I'm so glad that Jessica Watson challenged me to read it. And I will read Agnes Grey. I've been talking to somebody on the forum about Agnes Grey, so I'm going to read that.
Is that a sequel or just by the same Bronte sister?
It's by Anne. It's by the same. It was her only 2 books because she died when she was 29. But tonight is our Memoria Press Wolf Hall book group, and I just want to call Paul out on air. He read 200 pages, as he has said, didn't like it, and he's not coming to defend his position at all. Give us the opportunity to convince him that he's wrong and needs to finish it.
I have offered to submit a video defending my positions. Yeah. Yes, but that's a valid point, Tanya, that I cannot be convinced because it's one way.
That's right. That's not going to do it.
Well, Tanya, have you provided a similar venue for your colleagues to try and convince you of the merits of The Hobbit?
No, but I would.
You would? Okay.
I absolutely would. I would read. I mean, I read Lord of the Rings with you all and made my points known, and you made yours known. And I, recognize the brilliance in it. It's just not I'm just not really into goblins and orcs.
To be fair, I don't think Tolkien's into goblins.
Well, I think he is. They're everywhere.
It's not called the Goblin.
Oh. It's not called the Goblin, but I'm also not into little hobbits.
I'm not sure we can recover from that statement.
Yeah,
I need a little bit of reality. I understand. I get the brilliance of it. I really do, and I'm happy for anybody. I'm glad that I read them.
We could have an Oxford style debate where each side gives their perspective and the audience votes on who's more convincing.
Oh, I like that.
I would lose
that would be
in a heartbeat when we're talking about Tolkien.
I look forward to what you select for the next
time.
Yeah. But I would also
what if it's bring up the bodies?
Oh,
is that the next one?
That's the next Wolf Hall.
Geez, no. But I would like to invite our listeners, not necessarily for our Memoria Press book club, but just for books that we're reading. Like I have plenty of academic books that I need to be reading, but as far as novels go, I'm going to have some, but also if we're not talking about something that a listener feels we should be talking about, we should read, that's something they could send us at podcast@memoriapress.com.
Oh, yeah, that's great. A suggestion.
I would love a book list.
Yeah, it would be helpful for us.
Yeah.
John?
Yeah. So I'm reading 2 books right now. Can I talk about both of them?
Yes.
All right. So the first one I'm reading, though I have put it down for a week because it's not pleasant, is Kristen Lavren's Daughter. By Sergei Debunking.
Doesn't Martin love that?
Have you read it before?
Oh, no, this is my first time. And don't get me wrong, I love it. But it's also deeply Norwegian and, therefore very emotionally upsetting and melancholic and all that. And it's not an uplifting experience.
It's not.
Even so, it's a beautiful, almost historiography of pre-Reformation Norway, and it's just on the merits of its kind of anthropological value at the very least, just describing in really vivid detail just the experience of being in this place in history, right? In this really mundane and kind of approachable way is awesome, truly awesome. But man, do I just shudder to think what our protagonist is going to do at each new step. She just leads herself down the worst path.
Kind of in a Thomas Hardy-like way.
Having not read any Hardy, sure.
You haven't read Hardy?
No,
you haven't read Tess of the D'Urbervilles?
I haven't, no.
Well, John, you need to get on it.
Well,
but talk about depressing.
If you need another depressing book.
Very good, very good. And the other book I'm reading is called If It Had Been Otherwise, which is a compilation of short stories by a number of authors from basically the early 20th century of alternate history, basically describing if certain famous historical events had gone the other way, right? So many historical events are the product of kind of obviousness. They're just the natural conclusion. But some are just flukes, right? Some really just depend on the whim of a particular person or a moment of inspiration of a particular person. And so without that little spark, a completely different set of events can be kind of kicked into action.
So how did somebody just compile these?
I have no idea. I don't know how they came together.
Did somebody just think, I keep reading stories about true life events that could have gone a different way?
I don't know who's responsible for the compilation of them. But
that's interesting.
Yeah. I think they were written purposefully for this book, however. So they must have been invited to do it.
Oh, so it's an older...
Yeah. And this would mean, I believe I should specify, this is pre-World War II. So this is Winston Churchill before the Churchill that we know and love.
Right. Interesting.
Okay. Interesting, yeah. Oh, so maybe so. So they are all in the same
time period.
Yeah. Oh, okay.
Well, and I thought The Man in the High Castle was going to be that sort of
alternate history,
because it's
kind of a popular genre now.
What if the Nazis won
instead
of the Allies?
Instead of the Allies.
No, it was a science fiction
Philip
writer.
K. Dick, right?
Yes.
Yeah.
And I stumbled on it as the television show, and then when I started watching, I was like, oh, this would be fascinating to go read. But then I realized it was actually more science fiction than just hypothesis contrary to fact, And so that was disappointing to me.
So it's really fantasy.
It is. Yeah. There's
Right.
more going on there than just that. Yeah.
That sounds like a good escape, John. A great book. I wrote it down.
It's a lot of fun. Yeah.
For somebody with a new baby in the house, I'm sure you don't have much reading time at the moment.
There's a lot that can be done with a relatively thin book in one hand and a relatively tall baby in the other.
Yes, but also 2 other children running around.
I do my reading at night at this point. Yeah.
After they go to bed.
Yes.
Oh. Well, let's move on to the next part of the show. We've been answering a listener question every episode. We've been trying to fit one in. So let's move on to one of those. We've got one today from Sierra from Pennsylvania, and she is asking us how she can maximize her time at homeschool conventions. I'm going to read a little bit of her question and then kick it back to you all. Sierra says, I'm quickly approaching my 3rd year homeschooling my 7 and 5-year-old with Memoria Press, which also means I'm quickly approaching my 3rd year of attending homeschool conventions. In PA, we're provided with an overabundance of convention opportunities. Then she goes on to say, the thought of attending even one homeschool convention feels daunting to me, solely due to the amount of stuff I am certain to encounter. I have our Memoria course for next year, so I'm not attending conventions for curriculum. Truthfully, I found conventions to be a fruitful place of learning for state homeschool requirements. I also think it can be a splendid place to find educational joys such as games and supplies to fill our days. However, weeding through all the stuff feels next to impossible. And here's her question. What do you really need to enrich a homeschooler's day after workbooks are put away? And what would you look for at a convention if you were homeschooling your children? I think she did a great job with her question because
it is a great question.
She laid the landscape out and then got right to it.
And it really is. It is overwhelming, even if you're not looking for curriculum.
Yeah.
There is so much there. And
she even says, she said, it took 3 days to slog through it in the exhibit hall.
Well, yeah, if you're trying to see everything in the exhibit hall, it is going, in most conventions, not all of them, some of them are smaller, but in most conventions, it will take you 3 days to slog through it.
Plus, you have to, plus if you're going to the talks, because you feel like those are going to help you and rejuvenate you, you know, that's a good reason to go to, even if you have your curriculum. To actually be able to listen, to meet people, you know, to be in the same room with people doing the same thing you're doing and finding it just as difficult as you do and challenging. For extra things, maybe I was just more relaxed than I should have been. I mean, Paul's told the story of his mom just having educational things in the house. But I honestly would just, for things after the school day, I left my children solely alone and let them do whatever interested them. So what I would be looking for, just for my particular children, would have been Legos or not coloring books. They hated to color. Just, you know, whatever they were interested in doing that I didn't feel was harmful and that would keep them away from screens.
Sure.
But once they were finished with school, I felt like they were free, and they were free from me for a while, for one thing. But the other thing is my kids were very slow, so our school days were longer than they should have been.
Got it.
I would chime in and say, first of all, I mean, I think this is great that she's trying to go into it sort of proactively of what ought I be looking for, rather than, if you go in just sort of saying, I'm going to find out what's there, you will be overwhelmed. And so, Tanya's giving a lot of credit to my mother, which I give too, but also the atmosphere in our household was not, we're done with school now, here's these 2 things you need to go do. It was sort of like, because anything in the household,
it was all safe.
It had been curated. Then we could go do whatever we wanted that was, in the household. And, and she was like, if you want to go out and play basketball on the basketball hoop, like that's fine too.
Well, that's good. That's gymnasium.
Yeah, that's right. I was getting my PE credits,
That's right.
But I often waited for my neighbor to come home, and he didn't get home on the school bus till 4:30, and I was done by noon normally.
Right. You had to entertain yourself.
There was a gap there, but I would say, if you're going in, first of all, you don't have to bring your kids with you. Tanya's talking as if sometimes she brought her kids. Sometimes I don't think my mother ever brought us. Right. I never remember going, but I would go in with maybe like something. Look for something that's entertaining, but hopefully educational, that you could bring back, and look for something maybe that's fine art driven. That's could be painting, could be music, could be. I mean, there's a lot of those kinds of opportunities at the conventions that you may find some good resources, but that's also coming from me and a family that tends to be lacking in that area. So that's the way. I mean, and I think that's one of the things you got to think about. What am I lacking? And then go, okay, I'm going to go look for these, and that way you can blow by any vendor that's not in one of those categories.
But there's also something really relaxing about not having the pressure of finding your curriculum at a homeschool convention, that you can actually just go in and window shop. And so I love the idea of that, because when I go to conventions and work them, there's a pattern where people are very excited on Thursday night. By Friday night, they are so tired they can hardly put a sentence together, and they're overwhelmed and they're confused, and they can't. I don't even try to sell people on Friday night, because they are not capable of making a good decision. And so they always say, I'm just going to go back to my hotel and I'm going to look through all this stuff that I've got, and then I'm going to make my decisions. They come back Saturday and they are like new people. But by Friday night, the majority of people there are totally overwhelmed. And I don't really know what the answer is for that, but it is a lot. Do you have the answer?
I have the answer. And I've learned this from years of being a child whose parents wanted to go on vacations with us. When you go on vacation, and you're saying, let's just say it's crazy, like going to Rome or something like that, going to London. It's like, okay, we're only there for a week. We're going to do all the London. Right?
Yes.
And then you force yourself, kicking and screaming, to have fun, as much fun as you possibly can, and you have no fun.
While you're going nonstop.
Yeah, exactly. Just a constant grind to experience this thing, and you're losing the trees for the forest, right? And that's no way to take a vacation, right? And the same applies, I think, to this as well, right? That if you go in with this sort of like, I'm trying to maximize my experience here, and I've got to go to a meaningful, seminar here and a meaningful seminar here, and meaningful seminar here. I'm not saying they're not meaningful seminars. Let me clarify. Then that's where the overwhelmingness comes from, right? If you go in with the general viewpoint that I'm not going to be so concerned about what is the practical application of this talk, what is the practical application of this talk, I'm simply going to coexist for 48 hours, 72 hours with people whose goals are the same as my own, whose, teachers, whose what they're saying is at least tangentially connected to what I want, even if I don't understand the connection. I'm just going to kind of let it
simmer.
Right. That's my typical experience.
And I think a corollary from this is don't try to see it all.
Yes.
These things happen every year. You'll find more the next year. You have the main thing already decided. You have your core curriculum. Go glean what you can, but slow down.
I think Sierra's a lot like me. She's got in the convention hall and felt like she needed to go down every aisle. And I do that. I can't read a magazine because I feel like I have to read every word. It drives me crazy. So I get a magazine and it may be an article I'm not interested in, but I still feel like I have to read it. And I struggle to turn the page and just, you know how people can just flip through a magazine? I am not that person.
Have you ever put down a book midway? I mean, I put down
only
Wolf
if
Hall.
I hated it. Only if I hated it. Yes. Oh, yes. I won't give a book more than generally 50 to 100 pages. And then if I really
so you
don't,
can do it for books, but you can't do it for vendor booths as
or magazines. Yes, or stores. You know, I feel like I need to. If I go into Speedway to get,
do you have to go down every aisle at a Speedway?
if I'm looking like, what do I want to snack? Like, say we're on a trip and I go and we get gas and I go in, I will go down all the aisles to make sure I hit all the snacks before I choose my snack.
How did I never know this about you?
Well, you shouldn't be surprised.
Well, no, but I've traveled with you enough that I should have noticed that.
Well, I don't shop with you. Well, if I want a snack, you eat so fast that I feel like I don't have any time.
I think, Sierra, that
Paul
we're getting
and I
a
have
good,
traveled together enough that
variety of the different ways in which we can engage in a
and now
fruitful
this has
experience
become
here.
very personal.
Right. We've learned a lot about Sierra and about ourselves. If what is driving her question, one of the things that's motivating her is the fear about what if I miss something I'm supposed to find. I think,
And there's nothing. If she's got her cores, she's got what she
That's
needs
exactly
to
right.
educate her children.
That's exactly
so then
right.
everything else is should be fun.
right.
And like Paul said, if it's classical music or if it's an art program or something like that, that's more than fun. That's also education, but it's fun.
Right.
You know, it should be fun. It shouldn't be another academic thing because we have taken care of that. And so all other time for the student should be things they want to do and like to do. And if that means going outside and
Playing
rolling in the grass for hours, that's fine. They've done their work.
Yeah. Well, Sierra, we hope you feel a little more liberated at our answer.
Enjoy the homeschool
Enjoy
conventions in Pennsylvania.
Yes. Good question, Sierra. Well, on to our main segment, which is tackling a fascinating and somewhat controversial topic, teaching Latin. There are a lot of myths about how it should be taught and if it's even relevant today. And I have with me, of course, John, our Latin director, and Tanya and Paul, you've both taught Latin. So we've got some experienced people around the table. So I want to tee up some of these myths and see if we can debunk them.
All right. We're all about controversy here at Memoria Press.
So here's the first one. Learning Latin by immersion is the best method. Is that true or false? And what do we have to say about that?
It becomes false as soon as we use the word best. Is it a method of learning Latin? Absolutely, right? There is no one true way to learn a language, right? I mean, there are so many Latin programs out there, so many English, French, everything programs out there. It means some of them just, burn and sink and fail, right? But just the variety out there tells us at the very least that some people are getting something out of most of them, right? So when people come out really strong for the immersion method for any language, but for Latin in particular, I don't necessarily find myself on a really defensive footing. What I do take umbrage with is when it is suggested as like the natural or organic or the kind of necessary way of learning language. Let's start with the homeschool setting because I deal mostly when I'm answering emails from people, I'm dealing mostly with homeschool moms, homeschool dads at home who are trying to do this themselves, right? Now, what we can say about an immersion-based program is that it is very much teacher-led. It depends on the expertise and the wherewithal of the teacher, right? They need to have a certain kind of prerequisite set of abilities in order to create an environment where immersion is possible, right?
Right. If the teacher can't speak Latin, then the teacher can't then the student cannot be immersed in it.
Right. And even if the teacher can speak Latin, it's, still quite difficult to create an especially effective immersive environment for the purposes of that kind of education, right? Again, most Latin teachers are not fluent Latin speakers, for example. Even I'm not a fluent Latin speaker the way that I think I'd really need to be to try and pull off an immersive Latin course. So the merits of a grammar forward program, a grammar-based program, is that it is teaching from the part of it that is universal, teaching it from the part that is so kind of logically comprehensible that you don't need a specific background in order to approach it, right?
I mean, you mentioned, like if you do immersion, what you get out of that is you may be able to speak Latin, right? Like, and really the goal is different, right? So what's your goal of learning Latin? Is your goal being able to speak it? Or is your goal being able to engage with it, right? In a very, very deep way. And honestly, like I've watched people in modern languages learn by immersion, but they can't actually, they can speak, they can get along day to day, but they can't actually engage with that language in a deep way.
They can't take a literature course in the subject.
That's what I was going to say. You need to explain what you mean by engage with it.
I mean,
you mean in writing.
Whether in writing and reading and being able to say, this is exactly what this part of this language means.
Yeah, in a nuanced,
understand
kind of intuitive
the
way.
That's right. That's something you get by digging into the grammar. You don't get that by just,
immersing
and being able to live day to day. The other thing, what I wanted to push back on is the premise of immersion method is we are going to learn the way we learn languages as kids. But then they ignore the fact that kids are surrounded by that language all their waking moments. And that I think is something that gets lost in the push for an immersion approach to Latin or any foreign language.
That certainly, I mean, when speaking of the actual authentic first language acquisition process, certainly so, right? There is a lot of good literature on the subject of the immersive method being relatively replicable in the classroom. However, as you would say, it's not perfectly replicable. Say that fast 3 times. And there are those who try. There are many who fail, right? Imagine that it works. You're going to, again, have this tool that is poorly suited for engaging in Latin in most of the ways in which you can meaningfully do so, right? And so you're kind of honing this weapon that is sort of not really well suited for any particular kind of battle, except for, again, as I said before, the relatively dubious distinction of being able to speak to other people who know Latin in Latin, right? Which again is a very small pool and very often is a pool of people who are doing it for kind of obtuse academic reasons and not out of any particular love for Western civilization or for any connection to the Christian West or anything like that, right? We're talking like LARPers and historical recreators and so forth, right?
Yeah, I would like to. I mean, I have buddies who went to a program that the intent was to learn to speak Latin, but the prerequisite for joining was a grammar knowledge of the language. And so it's just sort of the ordering. Like, how are we going to order this? If your goal is to speak Latin, you still should go learn the grammar first and then go learn to apply it in an immersive sort of way.
That is a perfect segue to myth number 2. A grammar-first approach is dry, boring, and even outdated. We did just highlight the importance of a grammar-based approach, but is it boring? Is it worth it?
It's not boring.
Tell us more, Paul.
Yeah.
That doesn't mean students won't think Students might think it's boring,
there will
but
be
they
moments.
also are going
Yeah.
to possibly think math is boring.
Subjects aren't boring. People who find things boring are boring. No. So, I mean, if we ignore the somewhat charged language of boring and outdated or dry, and if it's no drier or more obtuse than, having to learn your periodic table before you learn your chemistry.
That's right.
And I apologize to my wife. She's a chemist, but, very few people are, doing backflips when they get to learn all about vanadium and selenium and so forth.
But they're thrilled after they've done it.
Right. Yeah. So
and sometimes they even go on and major in chemistry.
How many musicians are just psyched about doing their arpeggios, right?
Or
How
we
many,
like here to talk about athletes.
athletes with their drills,
That
right?
seems to be a common theme here.
So again, just learning the structure, learning the order and the discipline behind any process, any procedural art
May not be all that exciting.
It might not be all that exciting, but it's the necessary prerequisite to doing anything of value.
Yeah.
And two, there is, again, this is why I take umbrage with the whole dry or boring part, is that anyone who cares about doing a thing well will take joy in knowing the features of the thing that they're trying to excel in.
And if the critique is that the grammar is dry, a counterpoint could be that immersion is frustrating. And because you're not being given the tools to understand what's going on.
And you're having to look everything up.
And so, there may be moments where it's dry, but the student will actually be happier with the rules being clear to him than them being unclear.
Right.
That's right. And speaking of things being clear or unclear, myth number 3 is pronunciation is a crucial aspect of Latin learning. And I think this is an interesting one because we don't speak it conversationally today. So we often don't hear it. And there are different pronunciation guides. There's ecclesiastical, there's classical. So there's a lot here. Is pronunciation crucial? Is it key or not?
Depends on what we're talking about. I would say that in a classroom context, it's important that we all are able to say things the same way so that I can be understood when I tell students that this thing is this without having to put it on the board for them.
And consistent through the school too.
Yes.
That's important.
That's right.
That if I'm able to, I need to be able to express, again, let's take celi, be able to say that to students without them being confused about what consonants and vowels are involved, right? And thankfully, Latin only has really 2 schemes of pronunciation that you can work with. But if we're making a hierarchy of relative values here, right, what parts of this art are the most important for mastery, then again, the syntax of the language and the way in which all of its grammatical features operate together is relatively more important to comprehension of the language than using one or the other pronunciation scheme.
I think part of the problem is that in all of our Latin books, we start with a lesson on pronunciation, which immediately confuses people and makes them feel like, oh no, I can't do this. And I don't think there's any way around that except just to say, just as John said, do the best you can with it, but don't think you can't move. You still just need to go on and move forward and then refer back to it.
And we give audio CDs, which I think is so helpful.
And they aren't perfect either. We might have one person do a CD that pronounces a word differently, and it's
like a short I versus a long I sort of tendency.
Well, I have 2 things to say about that. One is situational and one is academic. The situational one is a significant problem is accent. That Memoria Press being the all-American, industry that it is, right? We have a Californian teacher here and we have an Alabaman teacher over there. I just realized I don't know exactly where the rest of you come from, so I didn't want to start pointing fingers.
I'm from Kentucky.
Kentucky, there you go. And so there occasionally are some accent hiccups that make their way into, as you said, the continuum of teachers that you may end up having, right? But I didn't really have an end to that sentence, I suppose. I just wanted to point out that is perhaps what a lot of people mistake as like a critical Latin problem is pronunciation.
Or an error
but it's really
what they're
not.
listening
But it's really
to.
just an error of, like user error often.
And plus, if students can make a switch because they switch between teachers all the time. And my kids had an ecclesiastical pronunciation until my oldest son got to high school. And then they hired a teacher who used a classical pronunciation. And he would get in the car and say, I can't understand a thing she said. Plus she was from Boston. So, but it didn't matter.
Right.
They got used to her. She got used to them. And it was okay at that point because the focus is not, they weren't talking to each other in Latin. So,
and that I think is an important, again, going back to the whole, spoken versus written Latin as the focus of the program. If you are going by a history of listening to the language, that's going to be a bigger issue than if you've spent your entire study focusing on it as a written artifact, right? It took me a while to adjust to using the ecclesiastical pronunciation. But, I would just say Kylie and they say, do you mean Chailey? And I'm like, yes. And then we move on.
That's right. That's right.
Each system has basically one way of doing things. There's another way of doing things, which means you have three options. You're saying it the classical way, you're saying the ecclesiastical way, or you're saying it weird, right? Yeah. And so it's usually pretty easy to figure out which one's being used and to make your way back into one of those two.
But I do need to say, I didn't say that I'm from Georgia, and I'm afraid Hunter will get upset with me for not calling out the great state of Georgia. I am from Georgia.
Very good.
I just needed to add that in because I thought, Hunter's going to think, I can't believe you had the opportunity. Hunter, our school rep.
Okay.
Who's back in
I've
Georgia?
never been to Georgia.
Well, you should.
I will.
You've missed so much.
To my academic point, which is a little shorter, but I think germane, which is that when it comes to, for example, the difference between long vowels and short vowels, which are probably the place where, if you're trying to be a real stickler, is where you find a lot of difficulty getting teachers to be consistent. This is actually a topic of some academic ambiguity. There are open debates on the subject of whether a long vowel and a short vowel actually were pronounced differently, or if it was merely a difference of sustension, right? Holding the vowel longer.
So what I'm hearing is anybody who's worried about that, give yourself some grace.
That's right.
Yes,
That's
exactly.
Exactly.
Essentially that we offer a system, and that system is what we could describe as conventional based on the literature that we have on the subject. But while we can speak with great specificity about how the consonants are pronounced at these times, vowels are just a little messier. It's generally true of language. Like if you ask, if you have Ian on the show at some point.
Even our spelling program.
That's right.
There's all kind, people call and say, or email and say, I don't understand how you're getting this. How is this a short A?
Right. Yeah.
That's not how we say this word. And it's all regional.
It's to a great degree, and the great majority of regional differences are vowels, not consonants. And in many languages, if you talk to Ian about Hebrew, for example, like the orthography of Hebrew is entirely consonantal. They don't even write vowels, right? Vowels are purely context. And so, that's an area of necessary grace, I think, anytime you're teaching a language, much less an ancient language.
Necessary grace. That's a good one to keep with you. Okay, moving on. Myth number 4. The reason we teach Latin is to improve SAT scores. So it's can help with
the reason
vocabulary, but it's not the reason.
It is absolutely a benefit.
It is. Right.
Yes.
That's right.
It is a reason.
It is a reason.
Yeah. The problem is the article there. Yeah, sure. If it does that for you, that's great.
So what is the reason then?
Learning Latin makes you think about what you're saying in a different way than you would when you're speaking English. That when you are speaking English, you express what you want to say the way English would have you do it. And 2, you just express it unthinkingly because we use English unthinkingly. But when you are thinking in Latin, right, you begin thinking in a deliberate way.
So
right?
It's training your brain.
It's training your brain. It's training it's training whatever gap it is in your brain between meaning and expression.
In a way that another language couldn't do?
In a way that another language is not suited for. Other languages have their own aptitudes. That English is really, really well endowed for expressing color in very precise values, right? Just because we have such a huge vocab. Our vocab is massive, and expressing discrete color values is a vocab matter, right? Having discrete words for individual colors. The vocabulary in Latin for color is very narrow. The ability to describe very specific shades of color in Latin is relatively limited. And so that is a thing I could wish to express, that if I'm an English speaker, I have a greater tool set for accomplishing than I do in Latin. Latin has a tool set that suits itself to other things, which are, I dare say, relatively more valuable in expression than fine shades of color, such as, again, the causal relationships and the sensibility relationships between multiple expressions and questions and statements.
I know I asked that question, but my answer to the reason for learning Latin is to be able to read the core text of Western civilization in the original words.
Why is that beneficial to read it in the original words when we've got all these translations available?
The answer to that question is what I said. The reason So let me.
I see where you're going.
Yeah.
I might be able to say it more concise than you do, but go for it.
Everything you say is more concise than what I say. I can't. No one can be less concise than me. Because if I'm reading a book in an English translation, some translator has had to decide, okay, this author is saying something. What is the sensible way of expressing that with that tool set I talked about before? English, right? English has its own aptitudes. And so I'm going to express this set of ideas with a certain set of aptitudes, right? Yeah. If I really try to capture the precise, like syntactic quality of Latin and English, it's going to be some goofy English, right? Mm-hmm. It's not going to look very good. And so most translations are artistically cutting and pasting and kind of shaping the language in a decidedly English manner in order to make it comprehensible to an English speaker, right? But if you know Latin and therefore are able to read a piece of literature in the original language, you're not just going to read the kind of bare, like, surface semantic value of what series of events happened in this story, but you can see exactly what someone using the Latin operating system used, the specific structure that he used to express a series of events. And that will give a much more texture, much more meaning, much more historical or philosophical content or context than you would have if you're merely getting that surface level English translation.
That adds value when you're reading the text. You're talking about.
Very much so. And I mean, you're also engaging with those texts in the mindset, I mean, that John was talking about, of the culture that created them.
I think you can see that. You can see examples of that. I couldn't see them in Latin, but I can see examples of it, even if you read two different translations of the same book.
We talk about that a lot, like with the Russian authors.
And some are more flow better, more readable, and others, some are stilted, more stilted. So you can see that a translation isn't a perfect.
Right.
Well, and
nobody's going to translate the same.
Those stilted ones may be actually more
accurate grammatically
to the syntactical structures,
right?
But it's not the enjoyable read that it would be.
I would write the stilted translation because I would stick to everything inside a box. Yes.
Yeah. Well, here's one of our last questions. Latin's really only for religious people, and maybe particularly those in the Catholic Church. And it does have deep roots there, but is it only useful for religious purposes? And
well, not if you want to read Homer.
That's right.
Homer's in Greek.
Oh, okay. Virgil.
Ovid.
I think the point is it's played a role in our civilization beyond the church.
And you think of the church fathers that are common for all Christians, right? You think of Augustine, and I mean, he's writing in Latin, and those works, when I say the core text of Western civilization, it's not just the Romans, right? It's all the early church. Through the Middle Ages. I mean, all the core texts are written in Latin. And so, but if you're not religious at all, it's still, this is our culture. It is important to have the keys to be able to open the treasure box.
Well, and Latin was pre-Christ.
Right.
It really wasn't necessarily religious. It was brought back by the monks because they did all the transcribing. So I think that's what makes people think it's a religious language. And of course, it is a huge part of the church. I wouldn't minimize that at all. Minimize that?
Minimize, yeah.
Minimize that. But
a concern of the religiosity of Latin is a little bit like being concerned about the religiosity of AD as a year marker. Right? Where it's like, yeah, okay, religious origin, but now it's just this thing, right? Now it's just the standard which we use to count the years, right? And you could say like, sure, yeah, okay, in terms of like the use of Latin in the context of English, such as supplementing the English vocabulary, yeah, sure, technically the kind of valve for that into the English language was largely through ecclesiastical Latin, but ecclesiastical Latin in the Middle Ages was also academic Latin, right? The non-religious, like regardless of the religious, you could say origins of English Latin, right? The Latin presence in English, to say that what started in a religious context makes it necessarily and kind of inextricably religious in application it's a very hollow argument.
I think that's helpful. Well, our last question, I hope we can make really practical, because I think we have a lot of listeners who might, I don't know, have some insecurities about this. One of the biggest myths, I think, is you have to be fluent in Latin to teach it. I think a lot of teachers feel intimidated because they aren't fluent and they think they can't do it well, or they've been entrusted with this child that they want to teach and a desire to teach it, but can they? What would you say?
It's hard for your child to know more than you do. And that's what happens. If my kids went to Cheryl Lowe's little Latin class, that was the beginning of all this. And they, very quickly knew more than me, and that is intimidating. Mm-hmm. And she knew that. And that's why, she wrote her Latin courses so that anybody could teach them.
Right.
And they're scripted out and give all the help that you could need. But what I would caution is that you learn enough that you can help your children and that you understand what they're doing. It doesn't mean you have to memorize all the vocabulary. It doesn't mean you have to memorize all the grammar forms, but you should be familiar enough with them, do enough with them that you do understand how a declension works, how a conjugation works. Because as John said earlier, Latin is very formulaic. It's very highly structured and ordered. So if you understand the basics, you can get through.
To answer your question in a way that ties back to the original question, if you're saying you must be fluent to teach Latin immersively, the answer is absolutely yes, right? You cannot teach a immersion program without being perfectly fluent in the subject, right? That's why I said earlier that different programs suit themselves to different environments, right? If you're a homeschool parent that doesn't have a background in the language you are trying to teach, then that immediately cuts off many of the different methodologies of teaching. That's one of the many reasons we choose the grammar approach, right? Is that it provides a way to go in not on the basis of knowledge of the language, but on the basis of simply having a set of things you can express, like, okay, in English, I know what tense is. I know what person is. I know what number is, right? Or at least I vaguely remember those things from when I got taught them back in English class. Okay, I'll start with those. There's a structure for expressing those things in Latin. Let's start with that, right? If you go at from that angle, then you need no background going in, right? Now, of course, with our programs, we provide, again, kind of a scaffold for our teachers to follow to kind of make up for any gaps in that process, right? But that would be impossible with a different methodology, right?
And that all of our courses, that is where they start.
Yeah.
Is by reinforcing that, it works the same in English as it does in Latin. So much does, a predicate nominative, a predicate adjective, but, you have to teach it in both because students do not connect them. But I do think that anybody can teach Latin. And I think that if it gets beyond you, usually your students get pretty independent before you may even be ready for them to be, because they are more confident. They become more confident Latin students than you. For one thing, all their brain cells are still firing. But I think anybody can and should do Latin.
With a structured program, it makes it accessible.
Absolutely accessible. Well, I can speak from experience.
Well, and that was one of the things I feel, Cheryl taught herself Latin as an adult. And I remember her talking about that. She went through several programs and it never made sense to her until she found a program that was structured and that made sense according to the structure of the language. And the program was structured in such a way to make that very clear.
Got it.
So that's one thing we try to work hard at.
And I think it shows. Yeah. Well, we've covered a lot of ground with Latin. Thank you all for your advice and your experience and the facts we now know about so many things. And thank you for joining us. If you have any burning Latin questions, you can email us at podcast@memoriapress.com, and we look forward to reading those and answering them on the air. Thanks again, and we will be back next time. Thanks for joining us today on Classical Etc. by Memoria Press. If you like what you heard, please Please like, subscribe, or share this episode or comment. We love to hear your questions and your comments. If you want to learn more about Memoria Press, please go to memoriapress.com. This has been Classical Etc. We're so glad you joined us, and we'll see you next time.